So now we're going to start learning how to look at things, but also how to talk about things. And this is chapter 1, part 1, the process of seeing. So I went to Texas A&M, which was really not a good fit for me, but that's neither here nor there. And I lived in a dorm that shared a common area with the boys' dorm or the men's dorm. And in this common area was a painting, and it was really, like, in my opinion, the god ugliest painting I've ever seen in my life. Pardon me for saying that, but it was horrible. And what I would do every day after lunch when I was going back to my room or after dinner, I would take that painting and I would rotate it 90 degrees. And no one ever noticed. Everyone just kind of walked past it. They didn't pay any attention to it. Everyone, if they thought about it at all, just assumed it always looked like that. So, like, when people go to the museum or to a gallery, or they're walking down the hall of their commons of where their dorm is, they on average only spend 7 seconds observing the paintings or artworks that are in front of them. And so for somebody that, like when I do a painting, I like sometimes I'll spend an entire year on a single painting. So if a person's only going to look at it for 7 seconds, that's kind of disappointing, but it's also my job to make my painting compelling enough that they're going to want to look at it. So the first thing we're just going to do is a little exercise in observation. This is a painting by Pieter Bruegel the Elder, and he did a lot of genre paintings. These are paintings about everyday life. He lived in Flanders, and this particular one has to do with children's games. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to be quiet. I know it's impossible for me to be quiet. I'm going to ask you to look at this for 30 minutes. Don't take 30 minutes, my God. 30 seconds. Don't take any notes. Just look at it. And then we're going to come back and we're going to try to see what all we can remember from looking at this. If this were in a classroom and this was a synchronous classroom, then I would talk to you about what you've seen. Okay, so let's ready, set, go. Okay, that would have been if you were in my classroom. But if I made you look at this for 2 minutes, you'd probably start looking at your phone. So there's all sorts of things going on. There's kids playing in mud. There's kids rolling hoops and playing tag and pretending like the fence is a horse. And look, this kid's getting ready to whip somebody. What the heck? So they're like, this other kid's carrying a kid on her back. This kid's getting ready to throw like a big old planter full of plants and down to the ground and probably hit these kids in the head. So when Bruegel did this painting, it was part of a series of 4 paintings that documented the ages of man. But it also documents the way people lived in the 16th century Netherlands and Flanders, which is where Bruegel was. And at that time, so they're like, some people are Catholic, some people are Protestant, and the Protestants believed that children's games were, and probably the Catholics too, were just as important as the pursuits of adults. And it was like, this is something that's commonly expressed in everyday literature. And so not only is this a painting that documents what games kids played, it also makes reference to the sacred, to their belief that children's games were just as important under the eyes of God as those of adults. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about, according to the Sayre book, what the roles of the artists are. So I'm going to just read these and then we're going to go through them. So artists help us see the world in new or innovative ways. It helps us pay attention to things or think about things that maybe otherwise we wouldn't pay attention to, or give us a new way of looking at things. And then artists make a visual record of the people, places, and events of their time and place, just like this Bruegel painting. It's documenting what kids were doing at that time. So when artists do this, they're documenting contemporary actions. So another thing is that artists make functional objects and structures more pleasurable by imbuing them with beauty and meaning. And that has to do by functional objects. We mean things like clothing and buildings and chairs and like kitchen cabinets and bowls and things like that. And then finally, artists give form to immaterial ideas, such as hidden or universal truths, spiritual forces, and personal feelings. So a lot of these paintings will be sacred paintings or mystical paintings or paintings that deal with, they're not all paintings, I'm using the word painting, artworks that deal with personal feelings. So let's start with the first one. So this is like, artists help us see the world in new and innovative ways. And I'm going to talk to you about an artist that his work does specifically that. So this is Andy Goldsworthy. He's born in 1956, so he's my age. He's ancient, like he's 100 years old already. And he, when he was in school, I'll come back to this, but so he grew up like working on farms in Scotland. He's British, and he grew up in Yorkshire, England, and he worked on farms, and now he lives in Scotland. And so he's outside all the time, but he liked making things. He liked drawing. And so when he went to college, he went to study art, and he went to Bradford College and then Preston Polytech. And like, so when students study art, as they further advance, they're given a studio and they're working inside, or they're working in a room with other students making their work. And for Goldsworthy, just didn't feel right. He was so used to being outdoors, and he hated this working in a studio. And he was kind of despairing because he thought, well, if you're going to be an artist, you got to work in a studio. And then while he was at school, this famous British artist named Richard Long came to lecture at the school on a relatively new art form that Richard Long helped to pioneer. And in England, they call it land art, and in the US, we call it earthworks. So Long, he had made his name in 1967 when he photographed a trail. This is it right here. I know that sounds like you're like, woo, a trail that he had created by walking back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until he wore the grass down. And like, this is something people and animals do when they're like, there could be like a sidewalk for a person, but a person is going to cut across whichever is the shortest route to get to anywhere. And so he was like influenced by like what people have been doing for millennium and what animals have been doing for millennium. But he also he would walk these really long distances, and then he would be out in the landscape and he would oh, look at all these rocks. I'm gonna make a maze out of rocks, or I'm gonna make a pathway out of all these pieces of broken up slate that I've found when I'm outdoors. And so so when Goldsworthy saw this, he was like, oh my God, I can work outdoors. I can work with nature. And so, and I'm going to come back to earthworks in a second. So Goldsworthy started going to the beach at Morecambe Bay, which is off the west coast of England. And he started making these structures out of seaweed and rocks and seashells. And he he knew that he would make these things, and he knew that they would be destroyed, which seems kind of odd, because maybe to you and maybe to me at first it seems really odd, because aren't you an artist and you want to make these permanent things that you can sell? Which that wasn't really important to him, and we'll get back to what was important to him. So these land artists and these earthworks artists, they what they did was they rejected the gallery system. They did not mean their work to be for sale. They made sculptural artworks from natural materials, and they incorporated the landscape as part of the earthworks. And their work made reference to ancient artworks like Native American, like North and South American burial grounds, which you might only be able to see or recognize what it is from the sky. They were influenced by natural phenomenon like constellations, rotations of the planets, sun and moon, the wind, the rain. And they were really interested in the slow process of erosion, that when you're working with natural materials that are subject to the elements, those materials erode. So here's a question. I want to say this, well, how do artists like this make a living? Well, one of the ways they make a living is they document their work and they show that work in galleries. And then that work that they, like the photographs or the drawings that they've done to prep for that work, that is for sale. They also write grants. And they also, even though they didn't want their work to be for sale, they also solicited funds from donors. So Goldsworthy, he continues to work in this fashion. His work is ephemeral, which means it's fleeting. It lasts for only a really short amount of time. This is an example of one of Andy Goldsworthy's works, where he's carefully sorted through all these different colored leaves and then rearranged them by color around the trunk of this tree. And so the colors in this are yellow, like orange, reddish orange, and even a darker, as the leaves erode, like even a darker reddish black and brown. So he makes works out of ice, and when he works with the ice, the way he glues the pieces together, he wears fingerless gloves, and I'll use a little warm water to slightly melt the ice, and then he'll hold it together until it freezes again. I couldn't do that. I have limited scleroderma, and my hands would fall off. So he also does some work in stone, and the stone work obviously stands the test of time, but everything else, like here's another one of the pieces that he sorted through leaves and rearranged them by color. Those, they just last for just a very short, small amount of time. And so this is something Goldsworthy said. He said, nature's in a state of change, and that change is the key to understanding. And I want my art to be sensitive and alert to changes in materials, seasons, and weather. Each work grows, stays, and decays. Process and decay are implicit. Transient in my work reflects what I find in nature. So let's go back to those roles of the artists. So artists help us see the world in new or innovative ways. And so when Andy Goldsworthy or other earth or land artists make these pieces, then all of a sudden, because they're so different and than everything else that's around them, yet they're part of everything that's around them, that they draw us to them, and they make us pay attention to nature in maybe ways that we wouldn't otherwise. He also uses like ground up stones and melted snow, and he makes watercolors out of these on watercolor paper. So here are some other examples of artists helping you see the world in new or unexpected or innovative ways. One of these artists is Ken Gonzalez Day. He's from California. And so what Gonzalez Day did is, well, first of all, you just look at this tree and you go like, what a magnificent tree. And these photographs, by the way, are life size. They'll fit on an entire wall. So let me give you a little background on him before I tell you what this is about. So Gonzalez Day, he wanted, like a lot of people that are people of color, Latinos, have disappeared from California history. And so he wanted to find those people that that history had forgotten, but that were probably important figures. And while he was doing his research, all of a sudden he found out about all these lynchings of Latinos who were brutally killed. They'd been hung, lynched from trees. And so he found out about over 350 of them, and he started going to the places where the lynching trees were and photographing them. And then he would like look up newspaper articles from the time that the lynching took place, and he would take a line from that article and put it as the title of the photograph, so that if you just look at the tree, you're like, wow, look at how old that tree is. But then if you read the title, At Daylight, the miserable man was carried to an oak, then you start thinking that not only is this a tree, this is a place where a human being was brutally hung and killed. He also does a series of photographs that I believe he calls the disappeared. So these would be photographs of, and I'm sorry that this is graphic, but a photograph of a lynching, but then in his, he would take the photograph and he would disappear. He would eliminate the people that were lynched and just leave the crowd and the trees that they were lynched from. Somebody else who also makes us look at nature and the world around us a lot differently is James Turrell, and I'm going to include a video of his work in this folder. So Turrell is an avid pilot, and he was always fascinated by light. And he was also interested in perceptual psychology and the idea of simultaneous contrast. So what simultaneous contrast means is that, so these two colors in the middle are the exact same color, but when they're placed next to another color, such as this orange or this blue, that other color that surrounds it will affect how we perceive that color. So when we look at this one surrounded by orange, it looks kind of more lilac gray. And then when we look at the one surrounded by blue, it's the same color, but it just looks kind of gray. So he makes these installations. There's one at the Museum of Fine Arts. When you go from one building to the next, there's the tunnel, the light tunnel. That's by him. And he, a lot of times, you know, that one's like artificial light, but a lot of time he'll combine artificial light and real, and the sky, real light. So these buildings, they like, or these structures will have a big hole with a piece of glass in it where the sky shines through. And then like periodically the color of the interior lights, just like that tunnel, will change color so that it changes the way we perceive the light that's coming through the window in these buildings. I have yet to go to this, and now because of the coronavirus, I probably, pardon me, I just knocked off my headphones. I probably won't go for a while, but this is at Rice University, and it's always, I've always heard it's best to go at dusk as the sun is setting, or before dawn as the sun is coming up. And this is like a big pavilion, and the light underneath here will change color. And then you see the sky through this hole. This is Friend's house. It's the Quaker house in Houston. And it's so beautiful. I went to a concert there once. And it's the same thing where you can see the sky either in the day or the night through the opening in the skylight, and then the lights inside of the room will change color. So Turrell says his work's more about your seeing than his seeing, although it's a product of his seeing. He's interested in the presence of space, and that is space where you feel a presence, almost an entity, that physical and power that space can give. And by space, sometimes it means the space of the room, but also space in the infinite sky. And his work, he says he has no object, no image, no focus. Without an object or an image or a focus, what are you looking at? You are looking at you looking. So he wants to create this feeling of wordless thought. So now we're going to move on to artists that make a visual record of the people, places, and events of their time and place. And one of these people teaches at UH downtown. It's L. Franco Lee II. He grew up in Fifth Ward. His uncle was a member of the Black Panthers. His father, L. Franco Lee I, was a city councilman, and they often referred to him as the mayor of Fifth Ward. His uncle that was a Black Panther was also an artist. So L. Franco Lee, he documents contemporary events. Sometimes they'll deal with, like, this is the killing of Osama bin Laden. And because, you know, the people in the White House are watching it while it's going on, it's like a video game. So it kind of removes them from the fact that even though somebody that was so against the United States, like it removes them from the actual killing and makes them feel like they're playing a game. And then when I know a lot of people came over here from Louisiana after Katrina, and after Katrina, Franco Lee II, he did a whole series of paintings about that horrible nightmare for people that lived in the bottoms in the Ninth Ward when they like release the levees and let the Ninth Ward flood, and people were desperate, and the National Guard, who's supposed to help and protect them, instead pointed guns at them and acted like they were criminals. Here's another example from that series of paintings. And then this right here, this battle royale, this is a practice that on plantations and even after slavery, where the white plantation owners and white men would 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 put blindfolds on the black men that work for them or their black slaves, and then make them fight it out and until the death. And then this is another painting. This is really graphic. This has to do with the lynching and the horrible dragging death of James Byrd outside of Beaumont by like a bunch of guys who said that this is in Jasper, Texas. They offered him a ride home, but instead of giving him a ride home, they beat him up, and then they drug him from the back of their truck for 3 miles. So his paintings, they're not always, they're not very often about pretty things. He wants to expose people to never let them forget what happened. And you know, a lot of his work is drawn in almost like a comic book style, which like will draw you into the painting, and then it hits you what these paintings are really about. He wants people to know what was going on at this time in history. I'd be really interested to see what he's working on now. There's another artist, Jacob Riis. He was an early 20th century photographer, and he documented child labor. And my grandfather, even though he wasn't living in New York, where Riis was taking these, is Jacob Riis, by the way, taking these photographs. My grandpa was selling newspapers on the street when he was 8. He was adopted into some people's home, not because they wanted a child, but because they wanted a child laborer. And it was people like Jacob Riis exposing this child labor and homelessness and poverty that enacted changes in laws so that we don't have, for the most part, don't have little kids working long hours for little or no pay and in factories and stuff. And then the next person we'll go on to is that artists make functional objects and structures more pleasurable by imbuing them with beauty and meaning. And so this one amazing artist is Kane Kwei. And Kane Kwei was born in Teshi, Ghana. And that was back when he was born. He was born in 1922. That was it was known as the Golden Coast, and it was a colony of Great Britain at the time. So like a lot of parents, his parents didn't want him to be an artist. They wanted him to be a farmer, but he had other ideas, and he ran off, and he went to live with his uncle, who was a carpenter. And his uncle, one of the things his uncle made were, they were called palanquins. And palanquins were like these little handheld carts that people would carry the chief or some other royalty around in them. And this one chief, he wanted a palanquin that looked like a flying eagle. So Kane's uncle started making it, and then another in another nearby village, somebody else wanted a cocoa pod palanquin. And this is like a cocoa pod, but or maybe it's a yam, I'm sorry. It was a cocoa pod palanquin, but then the leader died, And so they turned it into a coffin. So then Kanye, like he started like building like all sorts of coffins. Like if if somebody like never flew in their life, but like imagine flying and make an airplane, or if someone had like kind of was a fisherman, he'd make them a boat or a fish to be buried in. This one woman, she like she had a bunch of 11 kids, and so he made her a coffin that looked like a big mama chick, and then he carved little bitty miniature chicks, 11 of them, that went into the grave with her. And so now his son and then his grandson, they continue the practice. Like here's an Air Canada, here's a big fancy shoe. This is back when there were flip phones. It's like a Nokia phone. Maybe it's not a phone. Maybe it's a game, something you play a game with. I don't know. I'm 100. Here's some others, like a cart of tomatoes or big giant turnip. Somebody else that would take regular objects and make them into beautiful things was Elsa Schiaparelli. She's like a fashion designer, and she was influenced by the Surrealist artists, which were a group of artists that came about right after World War I. And we'll go into more detail on them in another chapter. But so like here's a hat that she made that looked like a hand that went on a head, and here's a hat with all these like beautiful tendrils and curls. She was also influenced by the traditional dress of Tunisia, and so here's some of her dresses and costumes that she made. Somebody else that was also took regular structures and made them into these amazing things was Antoni Placide Guillem Gari y Cornet. He went to, he's Spanish, he went to architecture school. And the buildings in Spain, like when he was going to school, they were pretty ornate. And so that influenced him in part, but his became even more ornate, where he's using all this colorful tile work on them, and then they got even more like organic and ornate. And he like he starts, his style is very eccentric but amazingly beautiful, and he developed this new kind of structure, one that is equilibrated, pardon me, or that can stand on its own without internal bracing, which every building we live in, work in has internal bracing. So he makes it so the building kind of tilts into itself. So they tilt inward diagonally, so it's not to cause as much stress on the floors as they rise upward. And this is Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. He spent 40 years working on it. After a while, he started living in it. And then, like, eventually, while he was still working on it, you know, like, he left, and I think he got hit by a streetcar and died really tragically. But this is what the building looks like now, and this is the interior of it. Oh, 44 years of his life. So then finally we'll talk about artists who give form to immaterial ideas such as hidden or universal truths, spiritual forces, and personal feelings. And we're gonna talk about the people, the Dogon people of Mali. And the Dogon people, they make these granaries. Here's like a granary. There's these really elaborate granary doors, and they're not just places where they store grain. They store sacred objects in them. Families store important objects in them, but they have a real like spiritual meaning to them. So their history is that they believed that every granary represents the original granary that came to Earth, which is the granary of pure Earth. It's like an ark that came from another planet, and it delivered all life on Earth. And the symbolism on the granary, a lot of times it'll represent the body of a woman, so that has to do with like fertility and prosperity. It'll have spiritual ancestors on it with magical strength that that protect what's in there. It'll have animals, it'll have plants, and it represents creation and the system of order in the universe. The Dogon, they believe that thousands of years ago, they were visited by these beings, they're fish-like beings called the Numos of the Sirius star system. And the fish-like beings taught them about astronomy and like other revelations, and they also brought them the very first granary, which was meant to bind not me but men to Earth. They're this isolated tribe in Mali. They were never enslaved, they were never kidnapped and forced into slavery, and they have like their spiritual beliefs and their clothing, their costumes that they wear for these rituals are so amazingly beautiful. Another person that also we'll talk about is Belkis Ayam. She's a Cuban printmaker. I saw her prints at the Station Museum on West Alabama. They're gigantic and they're beautiful. There's very few of them that are in color like this. A lot of them use like the blackest blacks. And her work is inspired by an all-male secret society, Abakua mythology, that was brought to Cuba and Haiti from Nigeria. And it was a society of resistance to slavery and to protection of its members. And the most prominent female figure in this mythology is Princess Sidone. So she finds this enchanted fish, and this fish, whoever hears its voice, gets these great powers. So she went to tell her dad about the fish, and her father ordered her to keep silent, but she went ahead and told her fiance, and then she was given a death sentence. But in Manzo's work, she stays alive. And because she was silenced, like all of these figures, they don't have any mouths in her pieces. And all the imagery relates to the mythology surrounding the story. And then finally, I'm going to talk about Vanessa German. She lives in Pennsylvania. She grew up in this really violent neighborhood, and she was greatly despairing about this and started making these figures that are meant to heal and protect her community. A lot of these pieces are out of found objects. She like this particular one, it's a mother, she's crying, she's holding her child on her head, or the Virgin Mary's on a skateboard, and there's a sugar container that German stole from a plantation. There's a stop sign, and then there's this that says bullseye, fragile glass, made in the USA. And then when you really think about this, you think about the bullseye is on the backs of the African American community that's killed by police, or that's killed in gang violence. And she feels like this has been perpetuated, and the poverty has been perpetuated because of the enslavement of people, and there've been all sorts of barriers to to allow them to advance, and she just wants it to stop. And then one last thing about these pieces is that she had no idea about an Angolan and a Congolese tradition of similar figures carved out of wood and then embedded with nails and screws and all sorts of things. And these are called the Inkisi Nkande. And the Inkisi Nkande were power figures that were protective objects that house mystical forces to combat evil. So they're meant to combat um, like societal ills. They're meant to settle disputes. They're meant to protect people from illness, both physical and mental. And so she had no idea that she was drawing from this tradition. And I believe that is the end of our chapter.